Welcome to today's lecture. Today, we will be examining the extent to which Elizabeth had a productive relationship with her parliament. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we will study key historiography so to understand the different interpretations posed by historians about Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament. Then we will study instances when Elizabeth had a productive relationship with her Parliament. Before then studying how Elizabeth sometimes used her royal prerogative to prevent Parliament from discussing important political matters. Finally, we will examine the implications of Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament for the Stuart dynasty, and evaluate the extent to which Parliament had changed since the start of the Tudor age. Let's begin by examining the key historiography about Parliament. The most traditional view comes from Whig historians. They wrote in the Victorian age and take their name from the Whig Party, who emerged in the late 17th century as a party that fought for parliamentary sovereignty. Whig historians see the history of Parliament as a journey from subservience to power. They see the Tudor period as instrumental to this, since Parliament was an instrumental tool in the break with Rome and the victory of the Protestant faith. Despite this, Parliament was largely subservient to the Crown. There are a number of incidents from Elizabeth's reign that support the Whig interpretation of parliamentary history. The orthodox view emerged in the early 20th century, led by a historian called Sir John Neal. He published a book called Queen Elizabeth in 1934, which provided the accepted view of her reign for a generation. In this work, he argues that under Elizabeth, Parliament became more assertive and demanding of a political voice. He particularly focuses on what he calls the Puritan Choir. These were a group of vocal Puritan MPs in the House of Commons who infringed on Elizabeth's royal prerogative over issues such as marriage and the succession. He also argues that there is a shift of power from the traditional nobility and bishops of the House of Lords to the self-confident and ambitious members of the gentry who represented their regions in the House of Commons. Finally, Neal and other orthodox historians argue that by the start of the 17th century, Parliament was a body who were prepared to act as opposition against the monarch and their policies. There was very little challenge to the orthodox view until the work of Geoffrey Elton provided a revisionist standpoint. In his most important work, The Tudor Revolution in Government, published in 1953, Elton argues that the 1530s was a revolutionary decade, whereby Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell transformed the mechanism of government from a medieval system to a modern, bureaucratic system. Parliament was pivotal to this as an instrument of modern government. However, it was Cromwell and his colleagues who were most pivotal. Later, in the 1980s, Elton wrote specifically about Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament. Here he argues that Parliament was institutionally important as a bureaucratic tool, but it was not significant as a political body. Elton argues that all major policy was decided by the Privy Council, and then these policies were brought to Parliament so that they could be passed into law through legislation. There is certainly strong evidence to suggest this, much of which is discussed in the previous lecture on Elizabeth's relationship with her Privy Council. Let's now examine how Parliament had a good relationship with Elizabeth. The first, and arguably the best, example comes from Elizabeth's first Parliament, which sat between January and May 1559. In February, Parliament passed 2 key pieces of legislation: the Act of Supremacy, which made Elizabeth supreme governor of the Church, and the Act of Uniformity, which enforced the Anglican doctrine found in the 1559 Common Book of Prayer. However, this would not have been achieved if key members of the Privy Council didn't place pressure on Parliament, especially in the House of the Lords, where Elizabeth received resistance from Catholic bishops, known as the Marian bishops, as they had advanced their career under Mary's reign. Nonetheless, the speedy timing of these two important pieces of legislation are evidence that Parliament was willing to cooperate with Elizabeth, and, essentially, still played a subservient role to the monarch. Elizabeth maintained a largely positive relationship with Parliament during the 1560s. There were two sittings of Parliament, firstly in 1563, and then between 1566 and 1567. During these sessions, Parliament agreed to parliamentary subsidies to pay for military intervention in France in support of the Huguenots. However, it was during the 1560s that Neil argues the Puritan choir emerged as an opposition group. They raised their concerns over marriage and the succession, since Elizabeth was now in her early 30s, so there was limited time for the marriage to be negotiated and arranged, and then for a male heir conceived. However, Elizabeth was firm in her stance that this was not an issue that should be publicly debated in Parliament, that instead it was her royal prerogative to decide who, or even if, she should marry. There were also early calls for reform to the Elizabethan settlement, so that it would move more in a Protestant direction. But revisionist historians now believe that Neil has exaggerated the opposition at this stage. Most MPs were content with the moderate path taken, since it had brought stability. Elizabeth also had a productive relationship with Parliament when it came to their common approach to the Catholic threat. This is because both moderates and Puritans united against the greater threat of Catholic plots, and then later the threat of a Spanish invasion. Parliament met in 1571 in response to the 1570 papal bull of excommunication. Elizabeth was able to pass the first of the penal laws. This was the 1571 Treason Act, that made it punishable by death to distribute printed copies of the papal bull or to publicly deny the royal supremacy. Furthermore, Parliament also worked productively with the Crown in the 80s and early 90s to create a series of penal laws against practicing Catholics, or recusants, in England. This would suggest that when it came to religious strife, Parliament, the Privy Council and the Queen were united in their common Protestant goal, and were happy to put differences aside so to safeguard England as a Protestant nation. Furthermore, Parliament passed a quadruple subsidy during the 1597–98 Parliament. This was the largest amount of money granted by any one Parliament of the Tudor age. Therefore, it is a strong piece of evidence that despite challenges, the relationship remained strong. The subsidy was granted as a result of the ongoing war with Spain, which had also fueled a rebellion in Ireland, and because of rising inflation. It would be only 30 years later that Parliament would start withholding subsidy grants to Charles I in order to pressure Charles to change his policies. The fact that this substantial amount was granted at the end of Elizabeth's reign shows that Parliament was ultimately subservient to the Crown. The final example of the strong relationship between the Queen and Parliament comes right at the end of her reign, in 1601. This was when she made the so-called Golden Speech at the opening of the Commons in front of 141 MPs. In this speech, she spoke about the importance of her relationship with both her people and Parliament as the representative of her people. Historians consider it a triumph for Elizabeth, hence why it has been dubbed the Golden Speech, even though relations had become more strained in the final decade of her reign. Elizabeth knew that this was likely to be the final time Parliament met for her, and so many historians consider this to be her swan song. It would certainly suggest that relations between monarch and Parliament remained strong by the end of the Tudor age, despite the opposition presented by a vocal minority. Let's now examine the different reasons why Elizabeth did not have a positive relationship with Parliament. Firstly, Mary Queen of Scots became a point of contention from 1571 onwards. Following the Ridolfi plot, there were calls from vocal members of her Parliament for her execution. These only grew louder for the next 15 years later, until they united with the Privy Council. This came to a head in late 1586, following the proof of Mary's complicity in the Babington plot. However, this opposition should not be exaggerated. It was the Privy Council who had the greater influence over Elizabeth, especially William Cecil, who ultimately used manipulative tactics to convince her to sign the warrant. The second issue that Parliament became vocal about was the succession. There had been minimal criticism of Elizabeth's choice not to marry. The vast majority of MPs respected that this was an issue reserved for the Queen's royal prerogative. However, during her final Parliament of 1601, there were louder calls for Elizabeth to name a successor. Many MPs believed this went beyond the royal prerogative, and instead was a matter of national security. Regardless, Elizabeth ignored their pleas, and it was left to Robert Cecil to conduct secret negotiations with James to achieve a smooth succession. Another point of criticism was the Elizabethan settlement, especially as the Puritan movement gathered momentum. John Neal argued that the Puritan choir acted as a united opposition group in the 1560s. However, at this point, the Puritan movement was very much in its infancy. However, by the late 1580s, they had gained support in the House of Commons. One key example was an MP called Sir Anthony Cope, who during the 1587 presented the Speaker of the Commons with a revised version of the Common Book of Prayer so that it included more Puritan practices. He also presented revisions to canon law, the laws that governed the Church. In response, Sir Anthony Cope was imprisoned in the Tower, and Elizabeth shut down debate about the settlement. However, Cope was not imprisoned for long as he continued to serve as an MP through into James' reign. This example would suggest that the Puritan threat in Parliament was minimal during Elizabeth's reign. During her final decade as Queen, Elizabeth started to grant monopolies. For a one-off payment to the Crown, individuals or a company were granted the exclusive right to sell a particular product, usually a sought-after commodity. The best example of this was the monopoly the Queen granted to her favourite the Earl of Essex for the exclusive sale of sweet wine imported from the continent. Monopolies provided a quick cash injection to the Crown at a time of high inflation and ongoing conflict with Spain. However, the merchants in the House of Commons were highly critical of the practice because it prevented a free market and so prevented them from earning money from the sale of a variety of products. There is evidence that the MPs began to criticise this practice during the 1597 Parliament, and this continued during the 1601 Parliament. James would continue the practice of monopolies, so this became an ongoing friction between Crown and Parliament. There is one notable, if isolated, incident of an MP calling for freedom of speech in the House of Commons. This came from a Devonshire MP called Peter Wentworth, who in 1576 made a memorable speech in the House of Commons, where he defended the rights of MPs to speak about policy without fear of persecution for encroaching on the royal prerogative. However, Wentworth was interrupted by the Speaker of the Commons, who commanded for his arrest, something that the rest of the Commons supported. This shows that as late as the mid-1570s, the Commons remained subservient to the Crown and were critical of the lone voices who pushed against the royal prerogative. Once Wentworth was released from prison, he was readmitted into the Commons. In 1593, he presented a petition to the Commons, calling for greater freedom of speech. Once again he was imprisoned. This time he died in the Tower 3 years later in 1596. Let's now examine how Parliament has evolved over the Tudor period. A traditional view is that Parliament began as a tax-granting body, since Henry VII tended to call Parliament only when he needed a subsidy for a military campaign. However, this would be to overlook the ways in which Henry VII used Parliament at the start of his reign to enable him to consolidate his rule through important acts like the Act of Resumption and various Acts of Attainder. This suggests that Parliament has always been an important instrument in government. Parliament then played a much more central part in government during the reign of Henry VIII, since it was used to pass groundbreaking legislation for the break with Rome. Nonetheless, historians have used the phrase king in Parliament to denote how Henry VIII manipulated proceedings in Parliament so that every act was passed without major opposition. The real opposition came from the conservative bishops that sat in the House of Lords, who were easily quashed. Elton argues that Parliament became a crucial instrument of government in the 1570s, clearly evidenced by the numerous Acts of Parliament, but they were not yet a political body. This certainly has credence as every act was passed without amendments. By the time Elizabeth ascended the throne, there was a clear divide between the Protestant House of Commons and the more conservative or outright Catholic House of Lords. The main opposition Elizabeth received to the settlement came from the Marian bishops in the Lords, and many of these chose to go into exile rather than face persecution. In contrast, many MPs of the Commons had been the beneficiaries of the English Reformation, many of whom had purchased former monastic lands and so had become esteemed members of the gentry in the countryside. Alternatively, those MPs who represented southern port towns were becoming rich and influential due to their trade with the Protestant Dutch. Regardless of this, there is little to suggest that these MPs had become a united political group. They benefited from the boom years of Elizabeth's reign, and so remained loyal to the crown. However, the boom period ended in the 1590s, and this was when opposition began to emerge, notably about the practice of monopolies, but also the succession. There was also a sizable minority of MPs who wished to further reform the Elizabethan settlement. They did not provide significant opposition to Elizabeth, but that is because Elizabeth managed the situation well. She used her royal prerogative to censor speech in the Commons and imprisoned key individuals, such as Sir Anthony Cope and Peter Wentworth, who dared to challenge this. She also used her reputation, cultivated over 4 decades, to inspire respect from the Commons, best evidenced through the 1601 Golden Speech. Yet 39 years after Elizabeth's death, Parliament would raise arms against King Charles I. This resulted in their victory in the English Civil War and the trial and execution of a King of England for high treason. Therefore, we cannot ignore the seeds of dissent that had blossomed in Parliament during the later Tudor period. Elizabeth, like her father, managed this dissent well by nipping all seeds of opposition in the bud. James would manage this less successfully, and so it would grow, and under the mismanagement of Charles' reign, it would explode into direct revolt against the crown. However, it was Puritans in the politicized New Model Army, led by Oliver Cromwell, who would successfully achieve regicide. This Puritan movement began in Elizabeth's reign and had started to use Parliament as a platform for their opposition. Therefore, we must see how Parliament had changed by the end of Elizabeth's reign. It was no longer fully subservient to the crown, but had within its makeup the tools to become a major political body. Let's now return to our overarching question of, to what extent did Elizabeth have a productive relationship with her Parliament? Firstly, it is worth remembering that historians have disagreed about the significance of Parliament under Elizabeth, especially in terms of how subservient it was to the crown, and on the different ways in which it began to challenge Elizabeth's royal prerogative. On the whole, Elizabeth did have a productive relationship with Parliament. This is evidenced through how every tax subsidy was granted, including the quadruple subsidy of 1597. This positive relationship with Parliament was evident from the start, as in 1559, Parliament was used to legislate the Elizabethan settlement in a highly successful way. However, on several occasions, Elizabeth stood firm against Parliament, who tried to voice concerns about policies such as Mary Queen of Scots and the succession. Elizabeth was insistent that these matters were reserved for her royal prerogative. This did not stop isolated figures, most notably Peter Wentworth, calling for greater freedom of speech. Overall, Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament was a productive one. Like her father, she was firm against any opposition, using imprisonment to silence vocal MPs who infringed on the royal prerogative. Nonetheless, this shows that within Elizabeth's reign there were seeds of discontent that would blossom and grow in the early Stuart age, accumulating in the English Civil War of the 1640s. Thank you for watching. Tune into my other lectures to learn about Elizabeth's reign.